To become all-around strong chess player, you need to be very good in tactics and the strategy. Knowing tactical shots and maneuvering in the chess positions, in various positions, is very important. Knowing opening theory is very, very important. But every part of the game, every aspect of the game has a lot to do with the pawn structure. And subject to our discussion is pawn structure. Pawn structure is the most important part of strategical planning. Without correct pawn structure, you cannot get healthy positional game, and you cannot construct good strategical plan. Okay, let's start discussing pawn structure. Everybody knows, and the number one thing you learn about pawn structure, it's good to have connected pawns, and it's bad to have double pawns. It's good to have less pawn islands rather than more pawn islands. It's better to have less pawn islands. Well, that's not only, this is all true, but there are a lot of exceptions. Concept of double pawns is very, very difficult concept. But before we get there, let's discuss some kind of fixed pawn structures. What I mean by fixed pawn structures or frozen pawn structures, for example, e4, e6, d4, d5, e5. You see the pawns in the center, they are kind of frozen, and you don't see the structure of the position in the center changing in near future. Well, another type of pawn structure, the frozen pawn structure, is e4, c6, d4, d5, for example, e takes d, c takes d, bishop d3, knight c6, c3, knight f6, and bishop f4. You see, it doesn't look like black can go e5 anytime soon, and we have kind of fixed pawn structure. White is not planning on playing c4 either. So this is kind of pawn structure that will remain the way it is for a long time. Now, understanding where are the plans, where one side is playing on this position and where the other side is playing, what are the plans? Generally, these positions, you can determine what side you have to play on by looking at the pawn structure. You see your pawns on b2, c3, and d4. They are placed on the same diagonal, and they are going towards the king side. So white's play is on the king side. And black's pawns after e6, f7, e6, d5, aiming towards the queen side. So black's play is on the queen side. That's the general approach, and which is correct. Now, well, there are some exceptions, but let's first learn the general rule. Now, suppose black plays bishop g4 now, and white goes queen b3. Now we're going to see very interesting aspects, how pawn structure can change, and it can change real quickly. If black plays queen b6, now what is this pawn structure? White can take on b6 and double black's pawns, and black can take on b3. Well, if white leaves the queen on b3, black can take on b3 and double white's pawns. Now, who is this good for in a first case, and who is it good for in the second case? Let me explain you. That's where the rule of double pawns, which is one of the most difficult subjects of a pawn structure. It's a double pawns. When double pawns are weakness and when they are strength. It's interesting to notice whether white takes black's queen or black takes white's queen. In both cases, it favors white. If white takes black's queen, you have black, you see black has double pawns. Black has double pawns that can't move. And after knight a3 and knight b5, white clearly has bad positions because knight has on b5 permanent square thanks to black's double pawns on b file. Now in this case, and the pawns will be weak. Now let's see if black takes instead knight d2 queen b3. Of course white should take here, but we're talking structurally. Suppose it was white's move if white didn't take and black took on b3. Now white has double pawns and they are very good for white. So how come we see double standard position here? Because white's double pawns are part of a pawn chain b2, b3, c3, d4. So how is it going to change the plan or the evaluation of position? After e6, white can go b4. White's next move is b5, kicking the knight from c6 square. And for example, if black played bishop e7, then b5, and after knight d8 maybe. Now pawn on b5 is very strong. Black has a weak pawn on a7. That determines white's clear positional advantage. White does not have weaknesses. White controls most of the squares in the center. Because of b5 pawn, knight can never come to c6. Knight is badly positioned on d8, and a7 pawn may become significant weakness. Well, after knight f3, maybe castling, and white can possibly double on a file. Of course, it's a long way to go, but those are the criteria which measures, evaluates this position. So this is very interesting concept. Actually, if we take different opening, we can take different opening. Let's take d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, knight f6, knight f3, or even bishop g5, bishop e7, c takes d, e takes d. And if white goes here, knight f3, well, instead of bishop e7, black could have done c6, and after knight f3, bishop f5, not allowing queen c2. But then white can go queen b3. Now what is this position? Black can go queen b6. Now we see totally reversed situation. If black takes white's queen, white is going to have weak pawns on b2 and b3. And if white takes black's queen, then black is going to take back, having the same strength of a pawns, allowing b5 and b4 in the future, and white may have weak pawn on a2. Well, in this is good for black in both cases. However, the price black pays to get favorable pawn structure on a queen side, price they are paying for it is bad pawn structure on a king side. White can play bishop takes f6, and now black is going to have choice. Black can take queen on b3, and when white takes back, then play g takes f. Now, this position is interesting. How do you determine what is strategical plan for white in this position? In those positions, black has definitely weaknesses on f7 and f6. And you see these double pawns, f7 pawn and f6 pawn, they are not part of the chain, pawn chain. So they are clearly weaknesses. The weakness of the pawns, when you have double pawns, remember, they are not weak only because you can attack them right away and you can win one of those, because that's not the case here, because f-file is not open and white is going to have very, very hard time winning any of f pawns. But the main problem for black in this position is that white is going to have squares on f-file. For instance, after knight h4, and if black goes bishop e6, bishop d3, and maybe outpost on f5 for a knight, or maybe knight e2 and knight f4, outpost on f4. In both cases, this is possible because of black's double pawns. They don't have g pawn that can possibly cover f5 and f4 squares. So this is, now you can search these positions and see a lot of games being played with this pawn structure. It was played when black took on b3 and when white took on b6. We had these positions too. And then black activates their pawns, b5 and b4, while white is trying to get some counterplay, some squares on a king side. For example, on bishop g6, the possible move is even f4. Now white wants to go f5, and if black goes f5, then the bishop on g6 is very bad, and besides, pawn on f5 will be lost after bishop d3. Now let's look for one very instructive example taken from recommended by me, one of the openings in our opening repertoire tape. e45, knight f3, knight c6, d4, e takes d, bishop c4, and here d6. Now d6 is not the main move. We know the main move is knight f6, which we're going to be analyzing also in a little bit from the point of view of pawn structure. But now let's look, for example, what's going to happen on d6. Knight takes d4, knight f6, and here white has two continuations. Knight takes c6, b takes c6, and e5, which is actually, it's not that clear, but it's one of the ways to play for white. But we are not going to discuss now opening ideas. We're going to discuss the pawn structures. Try to make you all better familiar with a battle for a pawn structure. Knight c3, bishop e7, castle, black castles, white takes on c6, black takes on c6, and white goes bishop f4. Now this is very, very interesting position from standpoint of pawn structure. Now, what can white's plan be? White cannot just jump in its center and somehow take advantage of the position in its center. No. White cannot do that because black has no weaknesses. Black has doubled pawns c7 and c6. They are not weaknesses because c7, c6 and d6 pawn represent pawn structure, represent island, represent structure. So in this position, black must play knight d7, and here is why. Or they can play rook b8, bishop b3, and then knight d7, which changes very little. It's very, well, black's pawns on c6 and d6, they control central squares. So here is the bad pawn structure for black I can show you, which can happen. Rook b8, bishop b3. Suppose black goes rook e8. Now after e5, d takes e, and bishop takes e5. This position is really bad for black, because now you see the c7 and c6 pawns, they are extremely weak, and they are not part of the pawn structure. They are just isolated and weak pawns. They are isolated weak pawns. But when pawn was on d6, they are part of a structure. They control squares in the center. Now let's see what happens after knight d7. Now the way you should avoid certain pawn structures, that's why black played knight d7, well, it's actually multi-purpose move. They stop e5 and they put their bishop on f6. And this bishop on b7 may come from after bishop b7 and c5, may be activated on different diagonal. Black's very difficult to take advantage of black's double pawns if it's possible at all, but they also serve the purpose why they are doubled, because c7 pawn protects d6 pawn, and the other second c pawn controls some critical central squares, not to mention then rook b8 also gets them a file. This is okay position to play for black. Definitely not okay to allow e5 and to exchange those pawns. Remember, double pawns in most of the cases are okay if they are not isolated and if they are part of the structure.